Welcome in and welcome back, everyone, to the Fighting Irish Faithful Show, Notre Dame versus Boston College. This evening, we're going to recap Notre Dame versus Clemson. Hope you're all still celebrating and feeling really good about that. We are going to look at this Phil Jurkovec situation and other past Notre Dame quarterbacks, recap a lot of the Boston College hate, and of course, do a stat dump on you for Notre Dame versus Boston College this Saturday. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink. Let's go, Irish.
Three wide receivers right. They're going to go for two. Back to throw. Walsh looks, has the time, lost the ball. The pass is batted down. It's batted down by Carroll.
Dawson throws, open receiver in the end zone. Touchdown, Notre Dame. Somehow, the Irish did it.
Out of the pack, 30, 35. Goodbye, baby. At the 50, the 40, the 30, the 20, the 10. Bye-bye, rocket touchdown, Irish.
Zibikowski looking for a block. Touch to the right to the 40. Gets a block, gets to the 45, 50. Up to the 45, 40, 30. 1 minute to beat. 20, 15, 10. He's done to the 5. Touchdown, Irish.
What's going on, Fighting Irish Faithful? Welcome back to the Undefeated Podcast, the Fighting Irish Faithful Podcast. We are shipping up to Boston this week with our Johnny Walker Red Label, but unlike Johnny Walker, who wears a top hat, a long sport coat, a walking stick, and a pair of Wellingtons, tonight we just got a glass of his favorite beverage and a Notre Dame hoodie. So here we go. Let's do this. So quickly, before we get into the show, welcome if you are a new follower. If you are one of my new followers from across the globe and across the United States, welcome specifically to the people in Panama and Germany. So those are some new people that are following the show. Also, Anchor is giving me some nice stats, and going through, I have 26 states represented: Indiana, Illinois, Washington, South Carolina, California, Texas, Michigan. You're welcome, Michigan. Pennsylvania, Ohio, Virginia, Wisconsin, Arizona, New Jersey, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Colorado, North Carolina, Minnesota, Kentucky, Maine, Alabama, Rhode Island, Mississippi, New Hampshire, and New York, the Empire State. So thank you, everyone from across the country. No one from Alaska or Hawaii yet. That we're looking for those guys. But yes, welcome, everyone. You, of course, can follow the show on the YouTube channel at Fighting Irish Faithful, on Anchor, as I mentioned, Spotify, and, of course, iTunes, or wherever you like to listen to podcasts on your smartphone. Or maybe you're old school and you actually still pull up your laptop or your PC at work or at home or whatnot. Anyway, does Alexa play my podcast? I'll have to ask her that later. That's another story for another time. All right. So Notre Dame defeats Clemson, if you hadn't heard. And if you haven't heard, get your head out of your ass. But what a great game. Again, 47-40. My voice is not as hoarse as it was last week right after the game. If you missed it, I did a post-game show right after we won, probably within 15-20 minutes, quick 5-minute prep. Poured myself a scotch and we went live with the mic. And I think it definitely took more time to edit some of the background fun Notre Dame music in there. So check it out if you haven't already. It was probably one of the more fun shows I've done, and certainly got a lot of hits on, especially on the YouTube channel. So thank you, everyone. Share and spread it, and let's keep this momentum going for the team. I hope that can maintain. One thing I was not able to touch on the post-game show was highlighting our defense. Though I gave them many praises and kind of general accolades, didn't really have the opportunity to deep dive into some stats from the box score. Let's share some of those with you now. Notre Dame had a total of 2 sacks against Clemson in that game. Those 2 sacks were in the second overtime period when Notre Dame was up, and first down, second down, sack after sack. It was amazing. The first one was shared by Ogundeji and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and then the second one by Dalen Hayes. I mean, talk about going out with an exclamation point. As soon as Notre Dame had scored their touchdown after the first overtime, and we got the ball, of course, to start overtime period number 2, I knew we were going to win that game because our offense was firing on cylinders. We looked ready. We looked focused. We looked like the stronger team at that point, and our offense had that momentum. We're going to go down on the other side of the field, closer to the tunnel and closer to touchdown Jesus, closer to the Basilica, my favorite place on campus. And I knew Notre Dame would score, and we did with a Kyron Williams rushing touchdown. And then, of course, right after that, 2 huge sacks, an incomplete pass, and then 4th and 24, Notre Dame's defense just eats it up, forces them to do some crazy lateral stuff, and we won. So amazing, 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 fantastic defense. You guys definitely won the game for us. Want to share some love out there to Kyle Hamilton, my favorite player. He was the leading solo tackler for the team. He had 8. Next would be Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, probably the defensive player of the game. 7 solo tacks. Shares half a sack with Ogundeji and 2.5 tackles for loss. So good on him. And then Drew White, our other starting linebacker, 6 solo tackles and 1 tackle for loss. So Notre Dame is definitely rising high. They're doing amazing things right now. We're ranked 2nd right now in the AP, 2nd in the coaches poll, just behind Alabama. And that should be no surprise. Everyone's given Alabama a lot of love. But Notre Dame's defense is certainly their strength. And of the stats of champions that I like to talk about a lot, 5 of them, Notre Dame's leading defensive stats right now at this point, 7-0, are better than the national champion average. 2 stats for offense are also better than the national champion average. Let's go through those. Rushing defense, I think the most important defensive stat, Notre Dame is 5th in the country right now, averaging 85 rushing defensive yards for their opponent. The national champion averages 105. Third down defense, Notre Dame 5th in the country again right now, 24% for their opponent. National champion averages 30. Scoring defense, Notre Dame 12th in the country, averaging 14.6 points per game for their opponent. The national champion averages 15.7. Tackles for loss, Notre Dame 8.43 a game. National champion averages 7.3. And fourth down defense, Notre Dame averaging 42% for their opponent. National champion averages 43%. So good on the defense. Those 5 categories definitely showing their strength and on par and better than what past champions like Alabama, Clemson, LSU, etc. have all done over the last 10 years on average. Offensive category, the 2 that Notre Dame's best and their strength, third down percentage, Notre Dame is 11th in the country right now at 54% on third down. National champion only averages 48%. So they're definitely ahead of the curve there. Rushing yards, no surprise there. Behind Kyron Williams and our great offensive line, Notre Dame is averaging 227 yards a game on the ground. The national champion averages only 166. So, and that's probably skewed because a lot of those national champions have Heisman level quarterbacks. But regardless, no, these are things that I think if you're in a discussion with any people who are Notre Dame haters, you tell them these stats. You tell them Notre Dame's dominating on third down. They're dominating in rushing yards. Their rushing defense is better than most people right now. You tell them those stats and just beat it into them until they finally get it. But most likely they'll still be Notre Dame haters, and, well, there's nothing we can do about that except sip your glass of whiskey and just wish them good day. All right, the subject everyone wants to talk about, which is Phil Jurkovec. Is it Jurkovec? Jurkovec? I've heard it all, and I honestly really don't care because he doesn't even play for Notre Dame. I personally am a fan of Jurkovec, so I think that's what we're going to do. Kind of sounded very Russian-Ukrainian there. Phil was, of course, our backup, and he is part of a long line of backup quarterbacks that have transferred out of Notre Dame under Brian Kelly. More to come on that. I find it ironic, and I think I saw this on Twitter. Someone said that the backup quarterback for Notre Dame ends up going to the backup college. So that might have been Rockney's Ghost who had tweeted that, but I thought that was quite funny. Phil right now is doing actually pretty good, I'd say, for a quarterback right now in 2020 college football year. And if you compare his stats up to Ian Book, most of them he has the edge. Completion percentage, Phil is throwing 62% versus Ian's 60%. Phil has 2,083 yards this season, averaging 260 a game. Ian Book, 1,535 yards, averaging 219 a game. Phil has thrown 15 touchdowns versus Ian Book's 8 and averages 1.875 touchdowns per game versus Ian Book's 1.143. So touchdowns per attempt, Phil is throwing 5.4%, Ian Book 4.23%. So those are all the categories that Phil has the advantage. Now, Ian Book has the advantage over Phil in the following categories. Yards per completion. Ian Book 13.5 versus Jurkovec's 12.1. Interceptions. Ian Book has only thrown 1 interception versus Phil's 4. Touchdown to interception ratio. Ian Book at 8 and Phil at 3.8. So clearly an advantage. Phil averages half an interception a game. Ian Book 0.14 per game. So also attempts per game. Ian Book is averaging 27, Phil 34. So personally, if you've listened to this show or seen me on Twitter, I'm a hashtag RTDB kind of guy. Run the damn ball. 3 things that are bad that can happen when you pass. Let's just run the ball. And we're running 60% of the time or better, we're in great shape. Unlike Boston College, who runs the ball only 50% of the time. Though Phil does have better numbers as far as yards and touchdowns and whatnot, let's see if there's really some weight to that. Is he playing easier competition? So I looked at Notre Dame's opponents and their opponents' pass defense versus Boston College pass defense. So Boston College opponents are Duke, Texas State, North Carolina, Pitt, Va-Tech, Georgia Tech, Clemson, and Syracuse. Notre Dame shares Duke, Pitt, Georgia Tech, and Clemson thus far, and then also has played, of course, South Florida, Florida State, and Louisville. Boston College, their opponents' average pass defense is 68.8 ranking in the country. Notre Dame's average opponent pass defense ranking is 56. So Ian Book, though his numbers are less, technically he's playing a stronger passing defense thus far in the season versus Boston College. Now, Boston College, their pass defense right now is exactly 56th in the country, which is right in line with the average of what we've played. So it is very, very likely that Ian Book will perform at the same level he is averaging for the season. That's just how the numbers work. Notre Dame, on the other hand, their pass defense is 35th in the country. So Phil's numbers are certainly going to come down. Phil is the 7th quarterback to transfer under Brian Kelly. I went back since 2010 and looked at all of the, big starting quarterbacks or big names that have been on the roster since Brian Kelly's been the head coach. And there are more quarterbacks that have transferred out under BK versus those who have stayed, graduated, gone to the NFL, what have you, or are still there. So let's just go down the list from longest to go to the most present. Number 1, Dane Christ, and I was happy to see him leave. That guy would just pee down his leg all the time. He followed Charlie Weiss to Kansas, so peace be with you. Andrew Hendricks, don't really have any bad blood for that guy, but he went out to Miami of Ohio. Gunnar Kiel, I don't think he actually took an actual snap at Notre Dame, but he certainly wasn't getting the playing time, and he ended up transferring to Cincinnati. But I figured it was worth mentioning him on this list. Everett Golson, who can remember that guy? But don't forget, he transferred to Florida State after the 2014 meltdown. It was kind of sad to see him go, but it definitely was the right thing to happen. Malik Zaire, our savior, who booted Golson after he got injured and Deshaun Kaiser came in, Malik Zaire transferred and went to Florida. Brandon Wimbush put in quite a bit of time as the starter, but then was ultimately replaced by Ian Book, and Wimbush transferred to UCF last year. And of course now Phil has transferred, and he is at Boston College. The only quarterbacks who have stayed or didn't transfer that I think made a decent splash at Notre Dame were, of course, Tommy Rees, now our offensive coordinator, and Deshaun Kaiser, the man. And, of course, Ian Book, he's still there. So that's it. Unless I've missed somebody, someone please comment. But I find it very, very interesting that we have had more transfers leaving under Kelly than those guys who have just come in and cycled through the program. I don't know what that says about the program. I don't know if that says anything about Kelly. And I'm not going to get too much into the ether on that, but it was certainly worth mentioning that this should be no surprise to Notre Dame fans. Yes, Phil, Boston College, we hate Boston College, right? I get that, but we also hate Florida State. You know, we don't like Charlie Weiss really, you know, and all these other guys have left. So he's just one of many other high profile names that we've seen to depart the program. So as we head up to Boston, Notre Dame and BC are going to be playing for the 26th meeting overall. Right now, Notre Dame leads the series, 16 wins and 9 losses. The first loss Notre Dame ever had to Boston College, believe it or not, was the 1993 game. That was the most heart-wrenching moment I think I've ever watched, other than maybe the 2014 loss at Florida State with the offensive pass interference call. But that game, Notre Dame lost 39-41 on a last-second 40-yard field goal attempt. And though that stings in our memories of Irish fans forever, I wanted to look more detail into that game. Now, unfortunately, it's kind of hard for me to find all the detailed stats of that game, but I was able to find the box score and the score breakdown by quarter. First quarter, Boston College was up 10-0. Then both teams scored 14 points in the second, so Boston College is up 24-14 at halftime. Third quarter's a battle. BC scores 7 points, Notre Dame scores 3. Then the fourth quarter, Notre Dame comes back, scores 22 points, but BC scores 10, and of course that field goal at the end to give them ultimately the win at Notre Dame Stadium. Bottom line is Notre Dame needs to come out fast in this game on Saturday to avoid that mistake. Notre Dame scored 0 points in the first quarter, let Boston College get the lead, get the advantage going in the first and second quarters there, and we can't let that happen. In addition to looking at Boston College's defense and their opponents, I also looked at how many points Boston College is scoring right now in 2020 in each quarter and compared that to Notre Dame's points scored on average each quarter this season. Boston College averages 5.5 points in the first, 10.3 in the second, 6.4 in the third, and 3.1 in the fourth. Notre Dame is higher in every quarter, thank God. They are averaging 8.3 in the first, 13.7 in the second, 7.7 in the third, and 4.9 in the fourth. So you add all that up, the average score, 24 points for Boston College and 32 for Notre Dame. One other item of note is, since the third and fourth quarter are Boston College's weakest quarters, I also looked at if there was a trend that could be inferred from Boston College's losses. They have 3 losses this season to North Carolina, Virginia Tech, and Clemson. In all of them, they have scored no more than 7 points in one of those quarters. And of course, one of them to Clemson, they scored 0 points in the second half at all. So, bottom line, Notre Dame needs to shut them down in the second half. Wear them down no more than 7 points in the second half, and that will guarantee a Boston College loss. Notre Dame, of course, comes off of a high win, and just as the 1993 Notre Dame team came off of a high win over Florida State, that Boston College game was a trap game for the 93 team. It is definitely a trap game for Notre Dame. But I think history is on our side to remind us, tap us on the shoulder and says, hey, remember 93, remember 93. Though Notre Dame is not ranked number 1 right now, they are still flying high after beating the number 1 team. However, there's another game that I think Notre Dame fans need to be reminded of. And though we didn't come off beating the number 1 team, it was, I think, until last week, Notre Dame and Brian Kelly's most convincing win since 2012, which is the win at Oklahoma. If you recall, the following week, Notre Dame 8-0, returning home, and they play the Panthers of Pitt. That game was a complete shit show. Notre Dame scored 6 points in the first half, 3 in the first quarter, 3 in the second quarter, and 0 in the third. And then, fortunately, scored 14 in the fourth quarter to force overtime, where it took us 3 overtimes to beat Pitt at home. I was at that game with the doc, with my folks. Lots of wine was required after the game. But some of the keys to why Notre Dame struggled against the Panthers that night, they had 3 turnovers, 2 interceptions, 1 by Reese, 1 by Golson, and 1 fumble by Sierra Wood in overtime in the second period. He fumbled on the goal line. Fortunately, Pitt, their kicker, missed his field goal. So, points off of turnovers. Pitt had 7 points off of those turnovers. One other thing of note is Notre Dame passed for 54% completion percentage. We had 53 passes and 51 runs. Yikes. High plays there. 49% run selection. But Notre Dame was settling for field goals. We were getting down to the red zone area, down to Pittsburgh's territory, and we were kicking field goals. We were not capitalizing on third down, not capitalizing on scoring touchdowns, and that was our Achilles heel. And though that's not a huge concern for Notre Dame this season, it's certainly not one of their strong points. Notre Dame needs to continue to improve in the red zone and score touchdowns. That's what they did against Pitt a couple weeks ago. They need to continue to do that, certainly against BC, but then going forward for the rest of the season. So watch out, Notre Dame. Remember Pitt in 2012, and remember the Boston College game of 1993. Do not settle. Do not get complacent. Stay hungry. Stay after it. This is a talented team, and they are dangerous. Boston College is coached by Jeff Hafley. He is in his first season this year. He is replacing Steve Adagio, who was fired last year. Last season, Steve Adagio took Boston College to a 3-9 season. Of course, Notre Dame was 11-2. This season, as I mentioned, they're 5-3. They are 0-3 versus the top 25 of Sagarin. and their record against Power 5 teams is 4-3. Notre Dame, of course, is 1-0 versus top 25 by beating Clemson, and 6-0 in their ACC schedule thus far. Jeff Hafley, of course, in his first season is sitting at a 62.5% win percentage. Brian Kelly inches up to 72.8% at Notre Dame with his win last week. For-year recruiting average, Notre Dame 13.25. Boston College averages 66th recruiting in the country over the last 4 years. Notre Dame is 4th in Sagarin, behind Clemson somehow, so I'm still kind of starting to question Sagarin and how it's doing its math, but regardless, it's an equalizer, and it'll tell us that Boston College is ranked 41st in Sagarin, so huge advantage Notre Dame there. Strength of schedule, though, Boston College theirs is better. They're at 28th per Sagarin, Notre Dame 51st. There are only a handful of categories that Boston College has the advantage over Notre Dame. Those are sacks per game. Boston College averages 2.75 versus Notre Dame's 2.71. Passing touchdowns, we already talked about that. Turnover margin, which is surprising. They have 6 total for the season. Notre Dame has 5. I imagine that will swap this game. I think there will be 2 interceptions by Jurkovic and lots of sacks. I think we're going to have him eat some pavement there. Every other category, Notre Dame has the advantage, from scoring offense to tackles for loss to passing defense to red zone touchdowns. It's all in Notre Dame's advantage. Last few stats I want to, of course, always touch on is the efficiency of our offense. Our yards per point is 12.26. Boston College 14.08. TeamRankings.com is giving Notre Dame an 85% chance of winning this game, and the spread right now is 13.5 points to Notre Dame. There really is no reason why Notre Dame should not go up to Boston, beat the crap out of them, and steal their lunch money and punch Phil in the face. There's really no reason for Notre Dame to not just dominate in this game. So I really hope for it. I'm going to be rooting really hard for our Irish, and let's take it to them. I do not like Boston College. They are probably a tier 2 hated team by me. We'll do that more in the bye week about my hated teams. But they're that like level 2 level of hate. Them probably in Michigan State and Ohio State, but they're not in the tier 1 space. That's reserved for 3 teams. That is all we've got tonight, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Don't have your kids listen to this. Come on, I'm drinking scotch and I cuss sometimes. So have a great week, everyone. Keep your Notre Dame pride flying. You got a bumper sticker or a one of those flags that sits out of your car window and flies in the wind. Make sure those are flying. And it feels like fall finally here in Indiana. The weird wave of warm weather finally was gone. So football in the fall, and Thanksgiving a couple weeks away. So everyone stay safe out there, and go Irish, beat Eagles.